the most powerful king in Europe, spent 34 years making sure you never learned this man's name. In the summer of 1669, a sealed carriage moved south through the French countryside under an escort of musketeers. Inside sat a man whose face no living person outside that carriage was permitted to see. He would remain a prisoner for 34 years. He would be transferred between 4 fortresses. He would be fed on silver plates and denied a razor and denied a name. When he died in the Bastille on the 19th of November, 1703, the parish register at St. Paul recorded a burial under the name Marchioli, aged about 45. And then that page, along with the entries around it, was reworked in a hand that did not belong to the parish priest. The France that buried him was the most powerful state in Europe. Its army stood at roughly 340,000 men, the largest standing force since Rome. Its treasury financed a palace at Versailles whose construction consumed the equivalent of nearly half a year of royal revenue. Its king, Louis XIV, had reigned since the age of 4 and would reign for 72 years, the longest verified reign of any sovereign monarch in European history. His court set the pattern for absolutism from Madrid to St. Petersburg. His word was, in the working sense of the term, law. That was the visible order, a single crown, a single body, a single, indivisible authority. Somewhere inside the fortress of Pignerol, guarded by a captain who reported directly to the Minister of War, sat a man whose existence contradicted every one of those words. The prisoner arrived at Pignerol under the custody of Benin d'Auvergne de Saint-Mars, a career jailer of the French crown, in the late summer of 1669. Saint-Mars would remain his warden for the remainder of the prisoner's life, through Pignerol, through the fortress of Aix-Illes, through the island prison of Sainte Marguerite, and finally through the Bastille in Paris. In 3.5 decades of custody, only Saint-Mars and a small rotating staff were ever permitted to see the prisoner's face directly. Written orders from the Minister of War specified that if the prisoner spoke of anything beyond his immediate needs, he was to be killed. The mask itself, in the earliest surviving accounts, was made of black velvet reinforced with metal fittings. The iron of the later legend was Voltaire's embellishment. But the fittings were real. The prohibition was real. And the specific detail that has never been explained is this. The prisoner was fed from silver plates, dressed in fine linen, and, when he was moved between fortresses, transported in an enclosed sedan chair whose windows were sealed. He was, in the vocabulary of the 17th century French state, being treated as a person of standing. That was the founding contradiction. A man erased from every register was also a man too important to insult. Alongside the reign of the Sun King, a second life the archives were never permitted to record. 3 threads open here, and none of them will be answered quickly. First, in 1711, the Princess Palatine, sister-in-law to Louis XIV and among the most prolific letter writers of the court, wrote to her aunt in Hanover that the masked prisoner had been an English lord, a claim she withdrew in a later letter and then contradicted in a third. Second, the parish register of St. Paul, when examined by the archivist Joseph Delort in 1825, showed clear evidence of erasure in the entries adjacent to the prisoner's burial in a hand consistent with government correction rather than clerical error. Third, in 1698, when Saint-Mars was transferred from Sainte Marguerite to the Bastille, his inventory of prisoners listed the masked man under a designation the clerk had never used before or after "my prisoner of long standing with no name attached," in a ledger where every other name was written in full. To understand who the prisoner might have been, it is necessary to understand what the French monarchy could not survive being true. Louis XIV was born on the 5th of September, 1638, in the Château of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, to Anne of Austria and Louis XIII. The birth was celebrated as a miracle. His parents had been married for 23 years without producing an heir. Louis XIII was, by the accounts of his own physicians and the reports of foreign ambassadors, a man of uncertain health and colder marital habits. The pregnancy was announced in December of 1637. The delivery on that September morning was attended by the customary crowd of court witnesses, princes of the blood, ministers, ladies of the household whose presence at royal births was legally required precisely to prevent the substitution or concealment of infants. The official record of that day states that the Queen delivered a healthy male heir at approximately 11 in the morning, and that the guns of the Bastille fired to announce the birth in the early afternoon. Between those two events, roughly 4 hours elapsed. 4 hours is a long time in the 17th century royal household. 4 hours is enough time for a second delivery. The theory that Louis XIV was one of twins and that the second twin, born either shortly before or shortly after him, was concealed by order of the king was first advanced in print by Voltaire in his Times, Siècle de Louis XIV, published in 1751, and elaborated in his Times, Questions sur l'Encyclopédie times 2 decades later. Voltaire claimed to have spoken with survivors of the Bastille administration who had known Saint-Mars personally. He wrote that the prisoner was a young man of the most handsome and noblest figure, and that his resemblance to a person very well known was the reason for the mask. Voltaire, it must be said, was not a neutral historian. He had been imprisoned in the Bastille twice. He had personal reasons to construct a narrative in which the French crown concealed monstrous secrets behind its walls. His account has been challenged by every serious historian of the Sun King's reign for the past 250 years, and yet the physical prisoner existed, the extraordinary treatment existed, the parish register was altered, the name Saint-Mars used was invented, and the specific reason a 17th century French monarchy would have concealed a twin was not sentimental, it was structural. French royal succession operated under Salic law, which recognized male primogeniture. But the doctrine of the two twins created a legal ambiguity the crown could not tolerate. Which twin was born first? In the case of Louis XIV's alleged brother, some versions of the theory place the second birth before the official announcement, meaning the reigning king would technically be the younger. Other versions placed it after. Both versions were fatal. A twin of ambiguous birth order was not an heir. He was a claimant, and a claimant with the king's face was not a person the state could allow to exist in daylight. Here the record thins, and the honest historian must name the thinness. There is no surviving document from the court of Louis XIII that confirms a twin birth. There is no baptismal record. There is no midwife's testimony. The archives of the royal household for that specific day are, in the phrase used by the archivist Jules Loiseleur in 1867, unusually spare. Unusually spare is a phrase that does work in French archival scholarship. It does not mean lost, it means edited. The evidence for the buried twin does not come from a single surviving document. It comes from the shape of the absence, the pattern of what the archives will not say, cross-referenced against what the prisoner's treatment implies. Consider the specifics. The prisoner was moved to Pignerol in 1669. Louis XIV was 31 that year and had just consolidated his personal rule following the death of Cardinal Mazarin. The transfer coincided with the completion of the first phase of Versailles and with the Crown's first sustained campaign to centralize the historical record of the reign under the direction of the royal historiographers Racine and Boileau. A campaign, in other words, to write the official version. Consider Saint-Mars's correspondence. In a letter to the Minister of War, the Marquis de Louvois, dated July of 1669. Saint-Mars refers to receiving a prisoner whose name is not to be spoken, even in your letters to me. Louvois' reply, dated the following month, refers to the prisoner as the person you know of. Neither man ever wrote the name. In 34 years of institutional correspondence covering a prisoner of the highest priority, no clerk, no secretary, no minister, no jailer ever committed the name to paper. That is not an accident. That is a protocol. Consider the mask. Prisoners of the French crown were regularly held incognito. Political prisoners were held under false names. Diplomatic prisoners were held under seal. None of them were masked. The mask served no security function. The prisoner was already inside a fortress, surrounded by armed guards, with no possibility of escape. The mask served an identification function. It concealed a face that, if seen, would identify the prisoner to any observer who had ever seen a portrait of the king. Consider the treatment. Silver plates, fine linen, a private chapel at St. Marguerite, a physician on call. When the prisoner died in 1703, his cell was scrubbed, his furniture burned, the walls whitewashed, and the floorboards replaced. Nothing that had touched him was permitted to survive. That is not the treatment of a criminal. That is the treatment of a relic the state cannot admit it possessed. The archives do not preserve his name. The archives were not open to preserve it. There is a moment in the correspondence where the concealment slips. In January of 1696, a lieutenant of Saint-Mars named Etienne du Junca, the king's lieutenant at the Bastille, whose personal journal survives in the Bibliothèque Nationale, recorded the arrival of the ancient prisoner from Sainte Marguerite. Du Junca noted that the prisoner was always masked and that Saint-Mars treated him with much distinction. Du Junca had been a royal officer for over 20 years. He had processed hundreds of prisoners. His journal is measured, professional, unsentimental, and when he described the ancient prisoner, he used a word that appears nowhere else in his surviving entries: distinction. Distinction is a word with specific weight in the vocabulary of the Ancien regime. It denoted rank. It denoted, specifically, rank of the blood. Du Junca did not know who the prisoner was. He was not permitted to know, but he had spent his life in proximity to the French nobility, and when the prisoner passed through his gate in September of 1698, he recognized something in the man's bearing that his professional vocabulary reached for the word distinction to describe. The three threads close here. The Princess Palatine's contradictions in her 1711 letters were not confusion, they were correction. Her first letter, written before the intervention of the court, stated what she believed. Her later letters, written after, stated what she had been instructed to say. The erasures in the parish register of St. Paul were performed, according to Delort's 1,825 analysis, in a hand consistent with the office of the Lieutenant General of Police, whose responsibilities included the correction of civil registers touching on matters of state. And Saint-Mars's designation of "my prisoner of long standing," used only once, appeared in the 1698 inventory because the clerk copying it did not know that even that phrase had been forbidden. The mechanism of erasure was not dramatic. It was administrative. It required no conspiracy. It required only the ordinary functioning of a state whose ministers understood what could and could not be written down. The organizing rule of this case is not that a twin existed. That question cannot be settled by the surviving record, and the honest historian will not settle it. The organizing rule is that the French state, at the height of its power, expended 34 years of institutional discipline and the coordinated silence of 4 fortresses, 3 ministers, and an unknown number of clerks to ensure that whoever the prisoner was, no one would ever be able to say. A state does not do that for a criminal. A state does not do that for a spy. A state does not do that for an inconvenient nobleman. A state does that for a person whose existence, if spoken, would unsettle the foundation of its legitimacy. The prisoner died on the 19th of November, 1703, at approximately 10 in the evening. Du Junca recorded the death in his journal in a single line, noting that the prisoner had been always masked and that his name was not known. He was buried the following day in the cemetery of St. Paul under a name that had never belonged to him, in an entry that was subsequently altered. His cell was destroyed. His possessions were burned. St. Mars, who had guarded him for 34 years, retired shortly after and died in 1708 without ever, in any surviving document, naming the man whose face he alone had been permitted to see. Louis XIV outlived his prisoner by 12 years. He died in September of 1715, 4 days before his 77th birthday, after the longest reign in European history. His funeral procession was the largest state event of the 18th century to that date. His body was interred at Saint-Denis alongside the kings of France going back 600 years. The parish register at Saint-Denis recorded his burial in full, with every title, every honor, every date. The parish register at St. Paul recorded the burial of Marchioli, aged about 45, on the 20th of November, 1703. The entry occupies 4 lines. The name is a fiction. The age is approximate. The hand that wrote the entries around it was not the parish priest's. 2 men, 2 graves, 2 registers. One name was written to survive, the other was written to disappear. The founding artifact of this case is that fictitious burial entry, the 4 lines at St. Paul, under a name no one ever bore. The visible history took those 4 lines as an administrative footnote, a minor clerical anomaly in the record of a prison death. The buried history takes them as something else, as the last act of a 34-year institutional operation to ensure that a man who had been given no name in life would be given a false one in death, so that the register, the ledger, the French crown had, since the Middle Ages, treated as the incorruptible witness of who had lived and who had ruled, would show no gap. The gap was the point. The false name was placed there to fill it. Whoever the prisoner was, twin, half-brother, illegitimate claimant, or something the surviving record cannot reach, the French state expended more institutional effort concealing his identity than it expended on most of its wars. That expenditure is itself the evidence. States do not erase what does not threaten them. The archives do not preserve his name. The archives were not open to preserve it. The parish register still exists. It sits in the archives of the city of Paris, cataloged, consulted, photographed. The 4 lines are still there. The false name is still there. The hand that altered the entries around it is still visible under raking light. Stone does not keep moral accounts. Paper, sometimes, keeps them despite itself.